Reactive Training Systems.
We've got a bunch of Canadians in our squad, don't we?
Yeah, and I'm collecting quite a few like Canadian powerlifting T-shirts, from different gyms and stuff like that.
Yeah, I feel like you go up there like every other month.
Yeah, I kind of feel like that too. I'm like getting to know customs agents by name. Hey, Jenny, how's it going?
Getting another T-shirt.
Right. Yeah.
So what were we going to talk about today? You'd mentioned chest fall, which is different than squish.
Yeah. So I don't know. The squat seems to be a bit unique, I think, in my estimation. That pretty much everybody is weak at the bottom of the squat, and there's not a whole lot of difference in that. But how you get into, say, a deficient position varies from lifter to lifter. In particular, today I was thinking about we should talk about what I've been calling a chest fall pattern. So you get people and they descend into the hole and they've got a good bottom position, but when they start to drive out of the hole, the hips come up and the barbell doesn't move. So you're getting that increase in back angle as they're coming out of the hole. Rory's a good example of somebody who doesn't do this actually, because it's such a common movement deficiency. I look for it when I'm looking at videos, and I just bring that up because you were one that I noticed doesn't do this even on really heavy attempts. There's not that sort of hip rise, chest fall pattern.
I mean, this is something that I work on a lot with my clients in person and online. There's a lot of reasons that this can happen. If we're talking, I think that we're probably mostly talking about with the low bar squat. You see this the most. And there's 3 reasons that I usually see this happen. One is they're likely adopting a too low bar position. So we want to, if the bar is too low or too close to the hips, then you're going to get this more horizontal back angle when you come out of the hole. So really just looking at where the bar, so like my first step would be to look where the bar is sitting on their back. Is it sitting too low, or is it just sitting in the right spot? If it's sitting in the right spot, that's probably not the reason that that's happening. The second thing, and I think that we've talked about this before, I'm not sure if it was on the last podcast or just in general we've talked about this, but when your knees and hips don't unlock at the same time, you get a reciprocal type of motion of the hip shooting back because the knees came forward on the way down, so the hips shoot back on the way up to kind of keep that bar over the middle of the foot. And then this third thing that I often see is that people just descend too vertical for a low bar squat. So people always think that you have to stay upright no matter what squat you're doing. You want to try and keep your chest up as much as possible, but you do need to allow the chest to drop to come into the low bar, in the low bar squat. You have to allow the chest to drop on the way down. So not allowing it to drop on the way down looks like you're getting early hip shoot or hip rise on the way up. So if you just don't have the right back angle on the way down, it looks more horizontal on the way up than it did on the way down. So there's like 3 things that I look at when I'm looking at that in the squat.
Cool. So you're really addressing it from a technical standpoint, that it's almost always just a mistake of movement that can be overcome by maybe reducing the weight on the bar a bit and consciously focusing on being in the right position.
Yeah. And that, oh, sorry, go on.
No, I was going to say, I think a lot of that comes back to balance. You're talking about the body wanting to counterbalance itself. If in what I see happening is that the lifter wants to override that balance because of their fear or an improper setup. But balance is basically having the bar essentially over the midfoot. And so the bar wants to try to get back to that midfoot no matter what. So the hip shooting up is putting the bar forward.
Balance, yeah.
Right.
And then even what you had just said about like consciously overriding those things with lower weight. Like I talk about this with my lifters all the time. They're like, oh, what exercise can I do to help? Should I do like should I use a band to work this way and prevent that from happening? And I'm like, no, you got to use your brain first. You know, you want to keep things super simple. You want to focus on the change that you're trying to make at lighter weight. And by using your brain and consciously executing the correct motion at lighter weight, that eventually transfers into your heavier sets, your heavier weights. So I just talk about conscious lifting all the time. You have to think. And a lot of lifters get like a little crazy about that. There's so much to think about. I'm like, yeah, lifting isn't just like mindless. You have to think when you're lifting. Eventually, by thinking about the cue enough times at appropriate loads, it transfers over to the heavier loads, and you don't have to quite think so much about it because it's the new motor pattern.
Yeah, I think that's when you reach enlightenment, isn't it? Is that you can lift it like no mind lifting, bring a little zen in here.
Right.
I mean, yeah, it's the same thing as what you're saying, Rory.
Yeah, you know, I used to have a list of cues that I had taped on the wall in front of me because you know I was training in the garage by myself, so that's what I had as kind of cueing reminders. So that's what I had, and it was a substantial list, like a bunch of stuff to think about, and I think I even wrote some articles about how much there was to think about. But I will say that, you know, as the years wear on, there's always something to think about, but the list does get shorter.
Right. So like 3 cues or 4 cues that you think about, knees out, chest up, midfoot, whatever, that becomes squat.
Yeah.
You know, or that becomes knees out automatically causes everything else to happen, you know?
Right.
So
Right.
yeah, I mean, and as you become a more advanced lifter and as you become, if you're an effective coach working with a lifter, you don't have to say A, B, C, D, E. You can just say A, B, and then eventually in like 3 or 4 sessions, it becomes A, and then you get a whole set and you're not saying anything at all because the lifter just executed it appropriately.
Right.
You know, if you spend the time to think about what you're doing for 3 or 4 weeks, in week 5, it becomes less thought. It just becomes squat.
Right. Yeah. It's kind of taking it's a complex thing that becomes less verbose over time. I've noticed that for my deadlift, especially for a while, there wasn't any word association with it at all. There was a feeling, kind of a more tactile feeling that I could feel when I was in the right position, but asking me to describe it was a lot more difficult.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there's definitely, you know, if we go into we could probably have like a whole podcast about cueing, but there's multiple different aspects of cueing. There's tactile, there's verbal, there's visual. So that's definitely, but you know, even if you're working with someone in person, you know, you can give them a verbal or a tactile cue and then ask them what they feel or what they were thinking when they did it the right way or when you put them into that position. So making those associations between the two really helps. And even, you know, what we've been doing with the video analysis, I'll ask them, what were you thinking when you did that set? Did you feel that that set was better than the other video that you showed me? You know, so you want to get that feedback across the board, whether it's in person or remotely.
Yeah. And just a quick aside for anybody listening who doesn't know, we do detailed technical analysis for our all access coaching people. That they're sending in videos every week, and Rory in particular is taking lead on that and helping people really refine their technique, and especially do so from an injury prevention standpoint. And so far, that seems to be really well received. I know that you're putting in a lot of time on that too. There's a lot of videos to review, and yeah, there's a lot of good exchanges happening, you know, and that's pretty cool.
I like it. It's fun.
Hey, Mike and Rory, over the life cycle of somebody's squat, as they move up, as they get stronger, do you guys, because I see this a lot where, you know, internally I even think that, you know, I'm kind of switching up cues on them because I'm seeing things that weren't there before and now happen as they correct. And I almost feel like it's this kind of circle of one muscle group getting stronger, they understanding something else, and then something else pops in, or working around injury. I think it's an endless kind of cycle of cueing somebody, especially if they're making progress. If they're staying with the same weight all the time, I feel like they'll get good at that weight, really good at that weight. But we increase by 5 kilos or whatever it is, changes everything, or throw something else in, or whatever it is, or new pair of shoes. Like there's so many other things that we don't even realize. But and that question does come up a lot too. Like, what accessory work can I do to make this better? So what do you guys say on that?
Roy, you started talking, but I don't think I could hear you.
No, I wasn't talking. I was going to say, well, Mike's the king of like supplemental work. So what would Mike do? And then I'll talk about what I would do.
Right. Well, so I like to address problems like this from 3 different levels. The first level is the competition exercise itself, which is kind of what we were talking about. You lower the load, you cue it differently or something, and you get them to basically practice it correctly, practice it how you want them to practice it. And that's probably the most essential piece. But I do think that certain movement tendencies like this tend to show us something that's going on with the lift. So if you have somebody who squats correctly with lighter weights, and then when the weights get really heavy, they have this chest fall tendency. I think there's some things that we can do. There's some things that we can do from the standpoint of assistance exercises to help them overcome that tendency. One thing that I like to do for this particular deficiency, I like pin squats for this one. Anything that basically causes them to have to keep that correct position and punishes them for not keeping that position. So pin squats do that. High bar squats do that. Safety bar squats do that. And I kind of think of all those as fitting into that assistance category. Front squats also do that, but for most powerlifters that I've worked with, by the time we get to front squats, the load is so light that it doesn't really fit very well into that assistance exercise category. We're usually talking about more supplemental exercise at that point. So that's kind of how I've categorized that. Paulie, what's your experience been?
My experience is more or less the same. I mean, I want to start with cueing, and as Rory said, I want to find out what they're thinking and where their head's at, because a lot of times, especially with a novice, and I'll get the sentence. There's so much to remember and so much to do during the squat. And so what I'll try to do is I think we've all talked about this, kind of create that hierarchy of what's most important. And my hope is that if we address that one particular issue, a lot of issues downstream will clean up. And then also kind of highlight, as you said, Mike, use the assistant exercises to maybe highlight the deficiency and have them correct it, and then come back to the their principal squat. And it's different. I mean, if we're teaching a novice, I think we have a lot more latitude. Sometimes it gets a little harder if we're in a meet prep phase where somebody is kind of nervous about taking time off, taking the weight down. The last thing you want to do is tell someone 4 weeks out to take the weight down, because they'll start to panic. Right. There's a lot of things. So but even there, just like when we're building programming for our lifters, for all our online clients, I mean, that's something that I constantly looking at as far as like how to get it to work without, hopefully you're not dying, Mike. Bless you.
He muted.
Yeah. It's basically, it's like, how to make this work, how to kind of internalize those cues. And I think that then, we can kind of create a relatable story between something like a pin squat and the competition squat. And sometimes things click. Like one of my, in the gym, one of my cues are that I tell lifters all the time, I don't want to hear the bar touching the pins. I want them to touch the pins, but I don't want to hear the bar touching the pins because I
Like
want
when they're doing pin squats,
when they're doing pin squats.
yeah,
I
don't
want
crash.
a good speed, but I want eccentric control, and then I'll make it even harder. And I say I want consistent speed all the way through.
Yeah.
So I don't want them to get 95% down and then take another 10 minutes just to find that landing.
Oh, I find that a lot of people just like go slow and then drop right into the bottom, and then
Yeah,
it's do the early hip rise. But
for the early hip rise, yeah, I've seen people. Well, I'm talking in this case, I'm talking about a pin squat.
yeah, well, I mean, but also, you know, some people will go slow and then drop onto the pins, and that's not what you want to see either. So
Either which way, if I can hear them, I get angry. So either way, just because.
I'll look at beater bars for pin squats. We don't let anybody use the good bars for pin squats or rack pulls.
No, well, I'll make them. I'll make it. You know, and here's a funny thing. Talking about pulls. We just had something pop up in our gym where I had a couple lifters who were actually for their deadlifts they were weaker on rack pulls, and we'll do block pulls instead of rack pulls because I like them a little better because you don't have that extra stretch in the bar already, so they have to tighten up a little bit more. But it was an interesting exercise to see that they were weaker in their rack pull than they were in their deadlift. And,
well, I've actually seen that a lot. I mean, it actually, for me, what I've seen is that if it's below the knee, if it's like right below the knee, like somewhere in that 2 inches below the knee, they tend to be weaker than if it was a little bit higher above the knee, weaker than their actual deadlifts. And I think it's because it's like the most mechanically disadvantaged spot to be pulling from. So that's why it ends up being weaker. Like my husband and his best friend were doing rack pulls the other day, and they were like freaking out because it was so weak. And I was like, but it's like the hardest part to generate force, you know? So
I see that especially with people who like to deadlift in a rounded position. Well, I guess I should say that it's the other way around, because people that like to deadlift in a rounded position, you know, they deadlift whatever they do, but then you put a block pull or rack pull, put it right below the knee. Well, now they get in this like really super flat locked in position, and you know, yeah, okay, you dominate rack pulls that way, but and then it doesn't transfer to the deadlift off the floor because it's not the same position at all. But yeah, I see that occasionally with people who are, you know, kind of doing more what you're talking about. You know, if they've got a typical deadlift position. Yeah, if they've got a more typical like deadlift position, then we see that mechanic happening. That sort of weakness happening when they're pulling below the knee.
And I would think that there's, you know, that comes back to a balance thing, that comes back to a mechanical thing. I think there is a correlation, a translation between having a weak rack pull and also position in the squat, especially if the knees slide forward or if there's some kind of chest fall in the squat. So I see people who are stronger in the squat or maintain a solid position actually do better with you know, they do better with the pulls when they're more solid in their squat position. I mean, do you see that connection? Like if they're able to kind of if they're kind of able to hold their back and hold their chest in the squat, they'll actually do better in say something like a rack pull.
That's interesting. It's not really a thing that I've given a lot of thought to before, but I mean, as I think about it now, it sounds truthy enough. But I'd have to think about it, I guess.
Well, I mean, so Rory, we're talking like sometimes can it be like a hip weakness? Obviously, if somebody is dropping their chest, if on the way up on the concentric part of the squat, you can unmute it, Rory.
There you go.
I thought Mike controls all this. If their chest is dropping, I don't usually find it to be a hip weakness. I find it to be like more like of a spinal erector weakness. Repeat the question because I was focused on being unmuted. Sorry.
Nobody Rory.
Don't mute me.
No, so the question is, I'm getting feedback.
too. All right, go ahead.
All right, so the question is, basically, and I guess spinal rectors being actually, what I was saying is there a weakness in the hips if somebody lets their chest fall, and does that hip weakness kind of correlate with a weakness or a strength in a block pull, which is something that I've seen in the gym where people who tend to let their chests fall a little bit in their squat are actually weaker in their block pull.
Why am I still muted? Okay. I don't necessarily want to say that it's just a general weakness or discrepancy in the strength of the hips and the back relative to the overall strength of the person. I want to say that typically if you see the person has proper mechanics when the load is light or moderate, and then they have the issue when the load gets heavy, I just think it's a factor of the load being too heavy. I think that both are going to correlate with each other. I don't use rack pulls enough to make a generalization between like the chest dropping and the squat and like having difficulty in the rack pull, if that makes sense.
Back to
the old feedback, man. Yeah, I'll have to do a better job of controlling
it. And I hope it's not derailing us too much to kind of for me to bring that up, but it's just something that has come up recently in some of the training where I've noticed that there is some kind of connection there where people are not able to hold it. And so to address what you were saying, Rory, these people are decent deadlifters, but their block pulls are lower in weight. Like they tap out a lot sooner in their block pull than they do in their deadlift. And so that's, to me, it's always been block pulls, rack pulls are heavier, partial range of motion, et cetera, but this just, I guess this is grossly highlighting one of their all of their deficiencies and making them all sad. So but I mean, maybe it all ties in, obviously, with
I tend to see, talking about those 3 levels again, when we get down to the supplemental level, that's usually where I'm looking for muscles, like muscle groups. Is there a weak muscle group? And I don't really even like the term weak muscle group because it's, maybe doesn't really convey the relative importance very well. Like people think weak muscle group and that's the thing that's got to be addressed, but that's really the thing that's going to make the least impact on your overall progress. But in this case, I have better success when I'm really training quads for this. And I mean, it's a squat, right? So that's not terribly surprising. Like the quads are the main thing going on there, so training the quads makes sense just from an overall strength development standpoint, but it does seem to help this pattern a little bit. Things that I tend to use for that are like I mentioned, front squats, but I mean, I'll go full bodybuilder on it. I'll have people doing leg presses and hack squats and belt squats and lunges and single leg work, anything that really targets that. And I think it's almost better to do it that way with the supplemental lifts because there's not as much systemic stress at that point. Like you could do a hard set of lunges, and the next day, you're okay, but if you do a hard set of, moderately high rep squats, then a lot of people are still feeling that fatigue moving forward. So I think there's just inherently a little bit less stress to go with those supplemental movements, and that's why they can be useful.
That makes sense. I know some people get freaked out when they see our programming to start where we don't have like full days of bodybuilder work, or there's less supplemental work, especially in the beginning, because you know they're to me at least, we're looking to build a skill first.
Yeah.
But yeah, we should come out with the full
bodybuilder.
Well, I just wanted to touch on like the safety squat and high bar squat in regards to actually fixing the early hip rise. So that's kind of like taking I mean, I've used that, and the reason it works is because it gives them the feeling of being more upright on the way up. And sometimes you can correlate that in their mind to say, okay, feel more like that when you do your low bar squat. So I'm not sure if it's necessarily building the quads, or like because it's a quad dominant motion that is helping with or transferring over to the low bar squat. I think it's probably more of the fact that on the way up they have to be more upright, and then they have a sense of what that feels like, and then it transfers to the low bar squat. And also I actually wanted to mention, because I've actually had a lot of, I don't want to say a lot, I'd say a small percentage of my clientele who has actually just like a super short torso and really long femurs, and they try and low bar squat, they'll get the early hip rise like big time, because relative to their anthropometry just makes it such that the bar is so close to their hips that they're almost horizontal on the way up. So typically I've found that I actually just have to move them into a high bar squat, and that works better for them. So it really comes down to where that bar, most of the time, it really comes down to where that bar is placed on their back, and then helping them identify what's right and what's wrong, what feels right and what feels wrong, and then having them address the movement pattern in their brain. And then if that fails, then you move into trying the supplemental lifts, trying the pin squats, trying the safety squats. I actually really like tempo squats, because they have to think when they're doing that. And that's what I'm trying to get the lifter to do to fix their movement pattern, is to actually think. So by slowing the motion down, you're giving them the opportunity to think while they're lifting.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. I completely agree on the pin squats or the safety bar and the high bar stuff, especially because at that level, at that assistance exercise level, it's not so much about trying to build up their quads or anything like that, but it's trying to get them to feel it's trying to reinforce the correct movement pattern. So I feel like things like high bar squats and safety bar squats, what happens if you exhibit that chest fall mechanic where your hips rise too fast? I mean, a safety bar squat really punishes you for that. You know, it really tries to roll you up, and the whole movement's a lot better if you keep that position. And in terms of a learning thing, like it's that immediate feedback. You know, wait, when I do this, the whole movement gets a lot harder, so let me not do that anymore, you know, and that sort of facilitates. And I totally agree on the tempo work too, especially, and I would probably, I can't think of an instance where I wouldn't extend that. So I would probably extend that to just about any sort of technical deficiency that you're trying to correct. Slowing things down gives you a chance to feel that correct position. You know, 303 tempo work is a really good method of doing it. People hate it.
Oh no. Hello?
Yeah, go.
Oh, what I was going to say, now that it's out of time here, is that the tempo work also allows you to feel when something's wrong, you know? So just as much as it allows you to feel something that's right, it allows you to feel like, oh crap, that was definitely wrong, you know? And also by going slower, if you hit an incorrect position, sometimes you can fail, or it just gets like a lot harder to get out of that position, you know? So, there was something else I wanted to say. I can't remember. Anyway.
Well, I guess it pretty beats the chest fall pattern pretty well. Yeah, just so kind of to go over things again, probably the most effective thing that you could do is to do the movement correctly. You know, so if you exhibit that pattern, to reduce the weight on the bar if you need to, but practice doing it right. And that's kind of what we always come back to, is specificity is king for, almost all these sorts of situations. So practice doing it correct and spend a lot of time practicing it correctly, and that whole process gets a lot easier. Some other things that you can do that might help you feel the feelings correctly: some high bar work, some pin squats, some safety bar squats, stuff along those lines, and adding in some direct quad work may be helpful over a longer time span. It's also probably going to be just good for your squat in general. So maybe a thing that you want to consider, considering the stress asymmetries in terms of how that fits into your program. Any other last sorts of comments from you guys?
Yes. Well, what I would just say, just in terms of like hierarchy, is first, I mentioned at the beginning, is first look at your bar position. Is it too low? Is it too high? And then also look at your hips and knees unlocking. Is your hip unlocking before your knee? Are your knees unlocking before your hips? Usually it's hips unlocking before the knees that causes that hip rise on the way up. And you just want to also look at your bar path. So
cool.
And then go into all that other stuff.
Tip of the iceberg.
What was that, Paulie?
I said this is a great start. We're at the tip of the iceberg, and it's always going to be, I think, something that everybody's going to be chasing. And I think that it's important that we get comfortable with that too, that it's hard for the squat to be perfect. And
sure.
we need to accept that as well, but there's plenty of ways that we can work on it, which makes it fun.
Yeah, definitely a long road to go from wherever we are to wherever we want to be. So
that's so deep, Mike.
Was that really deep, or did he just really not say anything?
It's a very fine line.
Well, yeah, that's about all the time we have, and I don't really have anything else that I wanted to throw in here at the end. So I guess just thanks everyone for watching. We'll come up with some more stuff to talk about, and see you next time.
Reactive Training Systems.